brown bag. Okay. Next, I'd like to mention, and Mildred, would you please stand up? One of our very own is going to be honored on April the 11th by the National Association of Spelman College Alumni. I think I got that right. And one of 3 people that are being honored this year. And this is only the 3rd year that they've done this. Congratulations, Mildred. And now for the commercial, tickets to that on the 11th, our luncheon, I can't remember what it was. Where's it going to be?
At Boudreaux's.
At Boudreaux's, and the tickets are $35, and Mildred will be happy to give you sell you a ticket over there. Okay? And lastly, now this is all in addition to our regular 3rd Thursday luncheons. Okay? On June the 12th, we'll have the reality check that is 18 hours after the close of the session. And that also is $35. We will have some of the top experts tell us what the legislature just did to or for the people of Louisiana. That'll be really interesting this year. Okay? So be sure with it on your calendar and look for the notice. And remember that was $35 also. Okay? Now, I didn't get a chance to ask our learned colleagues. Let's start with the economist. Okay? Dr. Tim Ryan is quite well known as the man who did the study that saved Louisiana. Quite literally saved Louisiana. When Duke and Edwards squared off in '91, if you remember, there was an awful implication. We got in the runoff with Duke and Edwards. In fact, you remember the famous bumper sticker? It's important. Vote for the crook. But Tim did a study on the impact versus Phoenix, Arizona, because they had refused to honor Martin Luther King Day. So he did an economic impact with Tourism and Convention Bureau. Is that correct, Tim? And it was so impressive. The Roma voters who had gone home because they didn't have a candidate anymore came back out when he showed them how much was going to hit their pockets. So allow me to introduce Tim Ryan, Dr. Tim Ryan.
Well, thank you, and I'm glad to be here in Baton Rouge. Under these circumstances, I used to have to come to Baton Rouge. When I was the chancellor of UNO, we were in the LSU system, and I used to have to come to Baton Rouge under less favorable, because we weren't treated very well by the LSU system. But we're no longer, the University of New Orleans is no longer part of the LSU system. So anyway, I'm sure you have been reading in the newspaper about what's happening and listening to television and radio about what's happening in the Louisiana budget. And you've heard a lot of talk about higher education and how massive cuts have been made to higher education over the last 5 or 6 years. You've also heard a lot of discussion about how the state is proposing to spend somewhere between $1.6 and $2 billion of one-time money in balancing the budget. You've probably also heard about the impact of repealing part of the Stelly plan, the income tax part, while leaving the cuts in the sales tax alone has impacted the budget. And I'm sure you've been reading about it live. The price of oil going down has impacted our budget. Well, I'm not going to talk about any of those things, although they're all true, each in its own way. What I'd like to talk about is what I think is a much more fundamental problem in the Louisiana budget that I'm not sure any governor and any legislature can deal with right now. Let's talk a little bit about spending. If we look at total spending in the state of Louisiana, I went back before Katrina, because Katrina significantly affected state government in a bunch of ways, which we may not have time to talk about. If we look at the increase in budgeted spending from 2003-2004 fiscal year, the 2004 fiscal, to the proposal, and this is before tomorrow's, I guess, announcement what the governor's revised budget, but the budget that was issued in September, that there's been a 3.9% annual increase in total state fund spending. We used to spend $16.8 billion, all sources, including federal. We're now proposed, and it'll be less than that, to spend $25.6 billion. That's an increase, annual increase of 3.9%. Inflation over that same period has run 2.2%. So our spending, in spite of all that you hear about budget cuts, has actually outpaced inflation. Now, if you look at spending from own revenue sources, that's not quite general fund, but it includes spending out of tax revenues and out of self-generated revenues, which are tuitions in the university is a big example of that. We've also increased over the period at a rate of 3.7% per year, again, outstripping inflation. Well, let's talk about higher education. Higher education in 2003, 2004, spending, again, from total sources, $2.2 billion. This year it's proposed, and it will be cut, it'll come down some, $2.6 billion. So higher education for almost the same number of students. In 2004, there were 214,000 students being educated. Now it's 216,000. So basically it's the same. We used to spend $10,400 per student. Now we're spending $12,100, which by any comparison nationally is low. So again, we're spending almost $400 million more in higher education than we were, but yet you hear about cuts and cuts. Now, what is the problem? What I see is Louisiana has a structural spending problem, and I use two examples to illustrate that. The first is talking about higher education. In the 90s, we decided, well, let's go back further than the 90s. In the 60s, we used to have a series of universities, 4-year schools that really wasn't anything in that time, such as community colleges as other states had. And we had technical schools, but we really didn't have any community colleges. But many of our local universities were community colleges, in effect. They had limited degree programs at the 4-year level and very little bachelor's, very little graduate programs. Well, all of a sudden, we got all this money during the oil boom in the 70s. And what did we do? We took all of these universities and we kept giving them more and more and more programs. So they all had bachelors, all had masters, many PhD programs. So what we did was we built up this series of 4-year universities. Now in the 90s, we said, oh, no, we need community colleges. So what do? Many states, what they do is say, all right, let's use the facilities for the community colleges, for the 4-year universities, and have a community college within that auspices. No, what we did was we built a whole infrastructure for community colleges, a whole community college system, statewide. But we have the same number of students. So what we now is, we've significantly increased the facilities. We've got to pay upkeep, we've got to pay maintenance, we've got to pay utilities, each university, and we have this structure for the same number of students. And it's killing the colleges and universities because they're paying so much more of their budget in percentage terms to maintain facilities. Let me give you an example. And you've heard this a lot, but we have 14 4-year universities in the state of Louisiana. The state of Florida has 11. Okay, now, Florida, everybody, my wife even said it to me last night when I was talking to her about this. She says, oh, well, but they're all old people. Well, they're not. Florida has between, and I just picked sort of mid-teens to 29 years old because it was easy in the census definitions, has 3,636,000 people in that age group, basically college educated, educable. Louisiana has 998,000. So for Florida has one university for every 330,000 people of that age group. Louisiana has one university for every 71,000 people. It's almost 5 times, they have 5 times as many. So what we're doing is we've got these facilities. Now, can the legislature do something about it? I don't think so. They had a chance after Katrina to really merge universities, make some sense. Didn't happen. I don't know that it will happen. Now, the real issue that nobody ever looks at and nobody understands liability in our retirement systems. In 1987, we passed a constitutional amendment that said by 2029, which seemed like it was 40 years, that we're going to fix this problem. The amount of the problem at that point was $5.8 billion. Big number. Which would have, had we funded it over a straight line basis, would have meant we had to fund $145 million a year. That was not what was done. What done, we said when they asked the actuaries, can't we sort of offload that to 10 years? I'm not in the legislature anymore. Can't we? So sure we can. So now, the current, not of last year, the latest report, it's gone from $5.8 billion to $19 billion. So now, if we straight line, because the Constitution says we have to do it by 2029, it's $1.4 billion a year, or 12% of every tax dollar that comes into the state of Louisiana. 12% of it has to go to funding the unfunded liability. Just in education, just in K through 12 higher education, it's a little over $1 billion a year that's going into the unfunded accrued liability. So that's money that should be spent on teacher salaries, on making our universities competitive again, and it can't be. Now, can they do anything about it? No, probably not, unless they get the voters to repeal the constitutional amendment, which I'm not sure is going to happen, or the state declares bankruptcy. So does the legislature and the governor play games with using one-time money? Yes. Have they done it? Have they done it forever? Yes. Is it a problem? Sure, it's a problem. Is it the real problem? My answer is no. The real problem is we've made policy decisions 20 and 30 and 40 years ago that are now coming back to haunt us. And I don't know how we're going to deal with it. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Our next speaker is John Muller. He is a former reporter at the Capitol Bureau for the Times-Picayune, and he has always been intrigued with the budget. So he is heading up the budget project. Would you give a warm welcome to John Muller?
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be back in this room talking to you guys about the budget, although it's kind of an odd date to be talking about the budget because tomorrow morning at 9 a.m. we're going to find out how the governor plans to deal with the $1.6 billion shortfall in the state budget, and you'll all be very surprised to know he hasn't consulted me. He hasn't asked my opinion. I have really no idea. The man to my left probably knows a little bit more, but those decisions are being made out of earshot. But I want to talk a little bit about kind of how we got here and what makes this year a little bit different. I mean, when we talk about, the $1.6 billion shortfall, we're talking about the difference between what it's going to cost to keep doing everything we're doing today, the continuation budget, and the amount of revenue we have coming in next year. That's it started out at about $1.2 billion, and right now, because of the drop in oil prices, it's grown to $1.6 billion shortfall. And everybody I talk to says this is an actual, real shortfall. We talk about these things year after year, but I think there's reasons to believe that this is a much more serious problem than we've dealt with in the past. One of the reasons is that a lot of the easy fixes to our budget problems have been done. Now I want to back up and just say, you've heard a lot of talk about the impact of oil prices. I think the governor has been quoted as saying the reason we have a budget problem is because the price of oil tanked, and that's good for consumers. He's right about the fact that it's good for consumers, but really when you look at the scope of the problem, it's 1/4 of our budget problem is due to the price of oil. 3/4 is due to decisions that have been made over the years on how to balance the budget. There's really 3 reasons we got into this fix. The first is the decision made during very good financial times. Ironically, after the storms in 2005, we had an economic boom in this state. State revenue came in at record levels. We had a lot of rebuilding activity. We had high energy prices. And we responded by the 2 largest tax cuts, income tax cuts, that this state has ever seen. That was the Stelly repeal that Dr. Ryan mentioned, and it took about $800 million a year out of the state tax base. That's one reason, and frankly, we've never really made up for that revenue with corresponding spending cuts. When you cut taxes, you cut revenue. The second has been, frankly, slow economic growth. We didn't get hit by the recession as hard as other states, but we've actually been recovering from the recession slower than most other states. So when your economy grows slowly, so does your revenue. And the third reason is that we've been giving out more and more money through the back door through these tax exemptions and credits that we've been hearing a lot about, that the governor's talking a lot about. The Advocate did a wonderful series on this and noted that it's grown from $200 million a year to $1 billion a year. So when you combine those 3 things, the Stelly tax cut, the slow growth in state government, and the increase in money going out the back door, that's when you get into a budget fix. And so far we've tried basically one solution. The governor, of course, has ruled out any increases in revenue. So every year the debate has been, how do we cut? And the best minds in state government and the best minds around the country have been applied to this topic. There was the Commission on Streamlining Government, which Senator Donahue chaired, that came out with 238 recommendations. We had the Tucker Commission that looked at higher education and the structure of higher education, how we can reform that. We had the Revenue Study Commission that spent months looking at our revenue structure and all these tax exemptions and came out with a report. Most recently went out and hired Alvarez and Marcel, a consultant firm out of New York City. We're paying them over $7 million to look for efficiencies and cuts in state government. But yet, even though we've applied all this attention to this problem, how do we cut government? Do we have a spending problem? We still find ourselves with a budget where I think people of good faith can't bring themselves to cut anymore because we've cut so deeply into core services that we end up with a budget that has $1.1 billion in this one-time money that is the reason we have to replace it. So what's the answer? I think from our perspective, the answer is we need to look at the revenue side of the equation. That's what we have not looked at for the past 7 years. I don't think we're going to look at it honestly in this session. There's been some talk about looking at refundable credits, but the fact is the next governor is going to raise taxes. The only question is by how much and from whom do you raise it, but you can't keep kicking the can down the road. There are as many ideas for raising this revenue as there are people, and I think a lot of people would have different suggestions than I do. But it's going to take an honest conversation about how much money we need to fund state government, to fund just basic services, because the way we've been doing it simply isn't working anymore. Again, I look forward to seeing what the governor comes up with tomorrow, but I think unless we have a real frank conversation about how to raise revenue and how to close some of these tax loopholes, then we're going to find ourselves having this exact conversation a year from now. Thank you.
And now we're going to hear from the business community. We have today, I'm sorry, I didn't bring your bio with me. We have Patrick Mulhern, who is the Executive Director or President and Founder of Celtic Studios and founder of the Louisiana Film and Entertainment Association. Would you be so kind as to welcome Patrick?
Thank you, Judy. you know, a guy, I hate it, but I have to represent the business community. I'm just one guy who runs a movie studio here in town. But you know, why am I here? I'm here because Jan's here. You know, the expression, you know, is so true. I'd rather be at the table than on the menu. And so I wanted to be here, and again, always just to put things in perspective. And so, you know, I've started kind of drilling down and looking at the budget and exemptions, which, you know, obviously the movie credit's part of that. But the pie that I've seen is this. There are $7.1 billion worth of exemptions in the state of Louisiana right now. $7.1 billion, okay? And when you look at the LED tax credits, which are there to create jobs and attract business and industry, that little slice of the pie is only 4.2%, okay? Now granted, film tax credits are about half of LED's credits right now, but that's about 2.1%. So again, we're talking about 2.1%. So let's put this thing in perspective. If we were going to take a whole hour to try to figure out what we were going to do with the budget here, we should probably spend about 2.5 minutes talking about LED tax credits and about 1 minute and 15 seconds talking about the film industry. But obviously people like to talk about it, so I'm going to go ahead, you know, and again, just to kind of put things in perspective for everybody. Let's just pretend with the 7.1 billion in exemptions right now, that's the problem. That is the main problem, and you know, that means that if we're going to go after the film credits and let's just get rid of them entirely, we would solve 2.1% of the problem here. Okay, so you know, we'd create a bigger problem. There's no doubt about it, because at that point you would lay off about 15,000 people. 15,000 people would lose their jobs. The state of Louisiana, about $717 million in household income that comes in every year because of the film industry. That would dry up and go away. So again, we don't want to create a bigger problem here, and we don't want to, you know, maybe focus on the wrong things. And I would argue that economic development is really not the problem, but it's actually part of the solution. Our economy and our budget are still way too dependent on the price of oil. If the current budget situation is teaching us anything, it is that we have to continue to diversify Louisiana's economy. This state is plagued by out-migration to this day. Out-migration eats away at our tax base. Good paying, non-polluting, non-government jobs are the solution, in my opinion. You know, creative industries, we provide just that. Let me give you a pretty good example right now. There's a big movie that's prepping in New Orleans right now about the Deepwater Horizon disaster. They are actually building sets right now, including oil platform sets, on dry land. And most of the people who are out there building that right now are out-of-work oil workers who would normally be out there building rigs or whatever, but these are welders and people who couldn't find work elsewhere. They're out there actually building a movie set. So, you know, again, maybe we're not exactly, you know, again, the reason why we're in such bad shape. You know, maybe we actually bring something to the table. So, you know, Gene asked me for some solutions, and you know, and I think that it's been in the paper. There's several things that are being talked about, and they're common sense. Common sense and competitiveness can peacefully coexist. There's no doubt about it. The one thing that kind of strikes me right now that's being talked about is we're talking about what can we do to affect the 2015-2016 budget. I mean, I hate to say it, but there are tax credits that are already in the pipeline, so it's sort of too late to make these huge, massive changes to the program and expect that you're going to get a bunch of revenue for this particular session. There is one bill that's being talked about that Representative Julie Stokes, I believe, is going to introduce, and it would actually have an effect, and we actually support it. And that's mandatory income tax withholding. So some of the biggest, you know, stars or people come in, people who get the biggest paychecks, they're going to get that money taken out immediately. So that's money that's going to come into the state treasury immediately. You're not going to have to wait for it. And we're going to collect that before any tax credits go out. So that's a common sense thing. The state of Georgia is our biggest competitor, is already doing that. It's got to happen. As a taxpayer, I support that. So that's the one thing. The other thing that's being talked about right now are caps on the program. You know, and it's one of those things that's kind of controversial. A lot of people in the industry don't like the word. They don't want to talk about it. But again, it takes common sense on these things. I mean, so let's look at it. Our biggest competitor is Georgia. Georgia has no cap. Okay, I'll give you that. The state of New York has a $400 million cap. The state of California has a $330 million cap on their program. Louisiana has never given out more than, I think, $252 million, is that the figure you're on, in tax credits for the film industry. It's not growing out of control. I know the Louisiana Budget Project make you think that it's just this out of control program is growing, but actually it dropped by 10% from 2013 to 2014. I believe the figure is like around 225 million that it gave out there. So let's just say the number that Senator J.P. Morrell is putting out there, which I think is probably pretty fair, $300 million cap. That gives you some certainty, so these guys can budget around it. It's never going to go beyond that. But again, it keeps us competitive. Not as competitive as Georgia, but that's okay. There's still some room for growth. So those are the two biggest solutions. I know everybody likes to talk about actor salaries. One thing I had some input on this. I think it's really important that we do a proportional soft cap, so that when you're looking at a budget, it's not all going to actors and actresses, directors, producers. You have like a limitation saying that only a certain proportion of that budget will go to above the line. Is it 50%? That would be a huge, it would be a pretty good compromise. Would we lose some projects? Absolutely, but those are the projects we want to lose because we need the crew and the resources for the ones that are having a bigger economic impact. So again, those are some solutions. They're not, I'm not going to save the budget by doing this because we're talking about 2.1%. But anyway, but like I said, any questions anybody has about the film industry, I'm more than happy to answer those. So anyway, that's my spiel. Thanks.
Well, if we could just get every, little exemption and everything else to give up 2.% we could probably we could solve the problem. But now the man who has to make the decisions, I'd like to introduce Senator Jack Donahue. He is the chairman of the Finance Committee, and he has looked at streamlining, and I'm sure he has a lot to say. Would you please welcome Senator Donahue?
Thank you. It's great to be here. It's nice to see you guys getting along well and coming up with some solutions to the budget problems in the state of Louisiana. I didn't think I'd see that, but I'm glad to see it. I'm an engineer, graduated from LSU, went into construction business, and started my own company in 1979. It is, we do work in the state of Louisiana, Mississippi, Alabama. It's the largest privately owned corporation on the North Shore. I mentioned that, so I would like to establish credentials with you guys that I'm a business person. I decided at the age of 62 that I was going to take all this expertise I had developed over those years and bring it to the legislature. So I ran for the state senate, fortunately got elected, and have been here for 7 years, and have been kind of shaking my head about some of these things since then. But one of the first things I realized is state government's bloated, and I wanted to be able to start looking at how we could reduce the size of state government, at least make it more efficient than it was. So I did a bill called the Streamlining Bill. I was elected chair of that commission, and we went through and made 238 recommendations for the state of Louisiana, many of which, probably all but maybe 30, have been enacted in the state of Louisiana. And I didn't see anything getting particularly better after we did all this cutting. So I said, being the business person, the equation has two sides. It's got all this expense side, and we're looking at how to cut the expense side. And listen, it doesn't make any difference what the legislature or anybody else does. It's always going to be bloat in state government. It's a $25 billion corporation, if you will. My corporation is so much smaller than that, and I'm sure in my corporation I have the same thing. So state government's just going to be bloated. We have to always work to try to make it more responsive. But so I said, there's another side to the equation. The other side of the equation is revenue. So I created a bill that allowed us to start looking at the revenue in the state of Louisiana, just so we can look at both sides of the equation. Because, listen, I'm an engineer. It's black or it's white, and I tell you what, that's how we got to look at it. So we did this revenue study in the state of Louisiana. It has some little different figures than what you heard before, but CEO Magazine's a magazine on occasion, had an article last month that it talked about the tax incentives in each of the states. And number one was New York, and number two was Washington, and number three was Louisiana. And the number they had for Louisiana was $11.1 billion that we give away in. I don't know all the things that went into that number, but as long as they did it the same for each of the states, you figure it's a decent comparison. So I divided the budget for each of those states by the number of dollars that they give away, and Louisiana was 40%. New York was number one, I don't remember, it was 11 or 13, but it was a pretty small number as compared to what Louisiana did. Kind of confirms my opinion that, we need to be taking a serious look on the revenue side. I don't think we need new taxes in the state of Louisiana, so let everybody be really clear. I'm not a tax guy. I don't want to raise taxes in the state of Louisiana. If I could be king of Louisiana for a day, it may take me longer than a day, but if I could be king for a day, what I would do is I'd take all the services that the state government produces, and I'd put a price tag on it, I'd put it on the table, and I'd have my budget over here, and I'd start taking things off the table in order of priority. And a priority in the state of Louisiana, I bet you we all agree in this room, what the top 4 things are. Public safety is always number 1. Roads and bridges are very important. Education is very important. Healthcare is very important. So let's take those guys off the table. And then if we have some money left, let's see what else is on the table. What's the next best thing we can do? And we take money off the table so we don't have any more left. And whatever on the table goes away. You see, that way you can kind of budget for what your priorities are. And let me tell you why we can't do that in Louisiana. Not just because I can't be king. We can't do that in Louisiana because everything's locked up. I'm going to use round numbers. We have a budget that's $25 billion. 11 of it's federal money. So that leaves us $14 billion in what we call the general fund. In the 14 general fund, fees and so forth are fixed. It leaves about $8.5 billion that we get as the general fund. And of that $8.5 billion, $6 billion of it is non-discretionary. That means the legislature can't do anything with it. We can see it, and we can touch it and smell it and play with it, but we can't do anything with it. So the legislature then has $2.5 billion that is discretionary money on the part of the legislature. And guess what we fund? This is set up by Constitution and statute. What we fund with that $2.5 billion is we fund higher education, health care, and the state offices. So when we have to cut $1.6 billion, it's got to come out of that $2.5 billion. So we have to cut higher education, health care, and state offices. Doesn't make any sense to me. If we had to prioritize stuff, it'd be exactly the stuff you don't want to cut in the state of Louisiana, but because they have locked all these other things away, we don't have the flexibility to do the things that need to be done to make the budget more responsible. So, this session is going to be very difficult. The budget that's coming out tomorrow is it has a $1.6 billion deficit associated with it, and that $1.6 billion is going to be taken care of by some savings in state government and a whole list of things. When you get through that laundry list of things, which I think for the most part is responsible, that leaves about $690 million. That $690 million, now we have to figure out where that comes from. That's going to be the big part. I think the governor's budget is going to have $400 million for cuts to higher education, $290 million worth of cuts to health care. That $290 million worth of cuts to health really turn out to be, because it's matching funds, to be $1 billion. So it's going to be just some massive cuts. Let me say something about higher education. Years ago, way before I was here, years ago, the way they funded higher education is all the poor presidents of the universities would come up here and they would beg for money. And if your legislator had been here for a long time, you could say, oh yeah, okay, Southeastern, you get this, and UNO, you get that, and everybody said, that's just not the way to do it. So let's establish constitutionally this separate power, higher education, and we're just going to, all legislature can do is fund money to higher education, but they're responsible for how it's going to be given out to the systems. Now, since I've been here in 7 years, I can tell you the systems, the 4 systems that we have, the system we got is broken. It does not work. It's not responsive. And I have tried, and other legislators have tried, to get higher education to start making some structural changes. Dr. Ryan talked about some of those things in his comments, and I wasn't amazed how right on with you all with your comments, because I've heard you for so many years, and you're very good at what you do. But higher education is not responsive to the problems in the state of Louisiana. And we can't force them to be responsible. We can't say, okay, UNO, you're not doing a good job, so we're going to give you less money than we're going to give SUNO. We can't say that. All we can do is, and that's what we've done over the last 7 years, is we have lowered the tide for all the votes. Because all we can do is give this one amount of money, and we're giving less. So all the votes sink down. That's not the way it's supposed to work. That's why the Grad Act went into effect. The Grad Act said, okay, if you're a good university and you meet these requirements and you graduate this many students and you're doing it in these particular subjects, then you're going to be able to raise your tuition. And if you don't do those things, you can't raise your tuition. So the thought process was we're going to allow those universities who are doing a good job to raise their tuition, which means they'd have more money. Those that weren't doing good wouldn't, and it would start to separate so we could have fewer than 14 universities across the state, 4-year universities. But it's never worked that way because, you know, a reporter outside who's not here asked me, he said, okay, he said, well, are y'all going to kick the can down the road again? I said, let me ask you a question. There's 3 things you can do. You can cut higher education, you can cut health care, and you can cut state offices. Let me ask you this on camera. What is it that you're going to cut? Tell me what you want to cut. Because that's your 3 choices. There is nothing else. And he's asked me another question, so I was really kind of looking for the answer because I might write it down to use it. But, so, you know, what the problem is, I see it, and listen, we know we're term limited, so if I would get reelected, I am running for reelection, but if I would get reelected, I'd have 4 more years up here. The problem is that this whole system doesn't work. This whole system is broken. It's been established for years, and people have been passing legislation that fostered their ability to be able to stay here to continue to be a legislator. Why, I can't figure out. But they desperately want to stay here, so now we can't. 12 years. No matter how great we are, we're going to be going in 12 years, and that's if you get reelected. So that's term limits, and that's the way it is. But this structure doesn't work. It was put in by people whose ideas were different than the people in the legislatures today. So what I'm looking for, and you might look for, this is not related to the budget that's coming out tomorrow, but what I'm looking for is with these 4 gubernatorial candidates is I want to see a plan of how we're going to fix Louisiana. It's broken. It's got to be fixed. A new governor coming in, a new governor can do so much in the state of Louisiana. It's really amazing. Actually, it could be fixed. So we want to get out of these guys is we want to see your plan, and we want to know precisely, we want to know in some detail how you're going to fix the state of Louisiana because it's broken. I'll tell you, my personal opinion is that if it's set up properly, that we would be able to keep a broad base, we'd be able to get rid of a lot of the exemptions that we have. I think we could lower taxes for all the people in the state of Louisiana. I really do. There's that much money in the state of Louisiana. If we can afford to give away $11.1 billion in the state of Louisiana, we can afford to do almost anything. So, and listen, I'm not picking on motion. I'm not picking on motion pictures. Somebody asked me the other day, do you want to do away with it? Of course not. I mean, they come in the state of Louisiana, they employ a lot of people, they do a lot of stuff, but do I want to spend the cap of $300 million on motion pictures? Let me think. I got $300 million. Do I want to spend it on motion pictures, or do I want to spend it on education? You know, that's the kind of choices we face. So I'm saying, do I want to have motion pictures here? Do I want them to continue to be here? Absolutely. But we got to do that kind of stuff in balance. It's got to be with priorities, and we're not there right now. And I think we have a long way to go to get there. Hopefully we'll have some intelligent things that come out of this session. I'm hoping to see higher education take the bull by the horns and make some structural changes in higher education that will allow it to be the great university system that it should be, and that it is funded properly. I think that's all I wanted to cover. So I think I'll probably have some questions, and I'll let it at that. Thank you.
Now, a lot of our presenters have said about things about putting things in perspective. I just wanted to add one additional note. We have a $25 billion corporation called Louisiana State Government, who generally has a new set of officers every 4 years, or at the bare minimum every 8 years. You do the math. It's kind of tough when you take off the entire top layers every 4 to 8 years. What would a corporation do, such as IBM or, you name it, if they change their entire upper management every 4 to 8 years? So I'm not defending, I'm just saying there's a reality to this, and it's called democracy. Okay? Get out and vote for the person that you deem most qualified. Now we'll take up questions from the audience. Yes, sir.
My name is Ted Hansen. I'm a worker.
That should come on.
My name is Ted Hansen. I work for the state of Louisiana.
Okay.
And obviously I'm concerned about the budget because my job is on the line, depending on the cut. And I personally am offended, and please excuse me because I'm going to say something kind of rude to our senator.
As long as I can say something back.
That he is not even considering revenue as part of the solution to the problem. And let me be more specific, because I also have a business background, that in talking about the incentives, the business incentives, they're talked about as expenses rather than investments. And I think that that is a really drastically wrong mindset. When we offer an incentive to a business, it should be an investment. And my proposed solution is that the Department of Economic Quality be required to prepare an analysis showing that the state will show a net income from that investment in the new business.
Ted, what is your question?
My question is, why are we not putting controls on economic development to ensure that the investments that we're making in these new enterprises and expansions pay back to the state a net income over time, and if that net income is not realized, that we stop the giveaways, and in some cases even demand money back from them.
I think that's a perfectly reasonable suggestion. The Department of Economic Development, remember, if the number $11.1 billion is correct, and I can't guarantee you that it is, that's what the CEO magazine had, but if it is $11.1 billion, the part that you're referring to, sir, is handled by the Economic Development Department, is $350 million, and I'll tell you that, in my opinion, when they offer a tax incentive, it comes before a legislative committee, and what you're talking about, the detailed information about how much it's going to pay back to the state, et cetera, we pretty much have that information. So I'm not as worried in Louisiana, and I haven't taken, I'm not as worried in Louisiana about the stuff that's administered by the Department of Economic Development, because I think it's a responsibly run department and they do their work fairly well. But if we're talking about $350 million there, we subtract that from $11.1 billion, which is the total number, we got to look at that other number too. And I don't think that's why I did that revenue commission, because I wanted to see, well, what other money are we giving away, and are we doing it? I mean, is somebody supposed to be creating jobs? Are they doing that? I mean, it's a logical and it's a good question. And the answer for the $350 million is we do that. The answer for the balance of it is we don't do that, and we need to. We need to know when we're giving our money away that we're getting what you're suggesting. We need to make sure we're getting it back. We don't do a good job at that.
Let me add to that, if you would, to defend my friend, although he's perfectly capable of defending himself. But when the biggest quote tax exemption we have is industrial tax exemption, billions of dollars. Now, why do we have an industrial tax exemption? Why do we give manufacturing firms an elimination of property tax? Well, the reason is because we have this goofy homestead exemption that is still the largest in the country that Huey Long put in when he was governor, because, you know, every chicken in a pot. And so we have to balance it out, because business can't be on the line for all property taxes, which they would be. So they said, okay, we'll give you. So we start out with a real mistake. the homestead exemption to the extent it is. I mean, most states have some little small. And then we balance it with another mistake. And those are the kinds of things, those are not economic development incentives. Those are not to give certain industries an incentive or a historic tax credit to revitalize some of our older property. Those are just things that are done because we have an imbalanced tax structure. And we have to change that. And the senator's right. The new governor doesn't come in and recognize that we need to make some substantial changes, then we'll have another disappointment.
Let me follow up with one question to Patrick. Patrick worked at the Department of Economic Development, and we're talking about tax exemptions. How many people do you have out validating how many jobs are being created for all those incentives?
Well, I don't know. Look, I haven't worked in LWVision since 2000.
When I was there were only 2. Okay? Is that sound about right now? Well, first of all, regulation and incentives should not be in the same house. Okay. Question?
Good afternoon. I am a principal investor, and I am a former Louisiana Labor Secretary, and I'm a lawyer, and I also an MBA. I listened for the last 7 years, and I watched for the last 7 years of what we've done with our budget. And I've listened and I've watched as everyone would kind of blame our governor for the budget, and he certainly has a share of the blame. But with all due respect to the senator that's here, Governor Jindal could not have done the things that he has done to Louisiana without a complicit legislature. And I think that the legislature has to start to take responsibility for some of the things that we are suffering in here right now. But let me just say, here's my question. In business school, one of the first things that we were taught was that whenever we got ready to do a business, we had to have a feasibility study. If the demand was not there that would sustain your business, then you needed to find a different business. The taxpayers, my question, I guess, is why should the taxpayers and why should our legislature continue to support these kinds of incentives, if you want to call them incentives? I don't know what the incentives are because they don't incentivize them to do anything that's in the interest of the people of Louisiana. But these kinds of subsidies to these people, why should we continue as a state to subsidize these things when they do nothing to make it better for the citizens of Louisiana?
Who do you want to direct that to?
Well, I want Jan to tell me because he's so good at it, but I really do. Senator, I want to hear from you why we continue to do these things that we know are not in the best interest of our citizens, and why revenue is not a part of the equation ever. We have to raise revenue. It's going to happen, someone said, with the next governor, but it needs to happen now. We can't wait for a new governor.
Well, I don't know. I don't know. Maybe you didn't hear me when I said in my 3rd year I created the Revenue Commission so we could look at the revenue of the state of Louisiana, realizing that the equation's got not only expenditure side, but it's got the revenue side. I made a proposal 3 years ago to, 3 years ago we had a $600 million deficit. Last year it was $900 million. Today it's even larger because of the backtrack of oil. But I made a proposal to eliminate so much expenditures in state government, balanced with so much revenue from some of these incentive packages. One of them was motion pictures, and I was told by the administration I want to get rid of structural deficit in 3 years, $200 million a year for 3 years. Makes sense to me. I think we can do that without a great deal of gnashing of teeth. And I was told that that was not a revenue neutral move, and I couldn't do that, it would be vetoed. So at that point, I realized that the problem was worse than I thought, because it's got two sides to the equation. Several people have mentioned revenue. I don't think we have to talk about raising taxes in the state of Louisiana. I don't think it's necessary. Is the legislature complicit with the governor in continuing what's going on in Louisiana? Yeah, to some extent it is, but I would pose to you the same question that is posed to us. You got $2.6 billion, you got a $1.6 billion deficit. With the $2.6 billion you fund higher education and health care, what do you want to cut? And understand what you said went a little bit further, because what you want to do is you want to get more than $2.6 billion on the table so that we can start to solve some of those problems. And listen, I agree. That I'll say this, and some of these gentlemen that are here know that when a bill comes before my committee, Senate Finance, if it's got a fiscal note on it, that means if it costs the state of Louisiana money, it doesn't come out of my committee. I'll kill it. It comes through, comes on the House, comes through some Senate committee, but it eventually comes to my committee, and we have killed every bill that costs the state of Louisiana money. If you don't have the money to do it, if you don't have a source of that money, it doesn't come out of committee. So to some extent, what you're talking about, I think a lot of people realize, and we're very careful about anything that we do. This gentleman back here was talking about making sure that we get our money's worth out of the money that we give away, that the state of Louisiana does benefit from these things by helping its people and supporting our educational system, both K through 12 as higher education. It's vital to the growth of the state of Louisiana. I realize that, and I think that when I had a choice last year, for example, they had this pot of one-time money, and we could use that one-time money. I got to tell you that I thought the growth of the government would be about 4.1%, and that the light at the end of the tunnel would allow us to have more revenue, which would cover some of those costs. So it'd be, we'd be getting ourselves back to being what I would consider to be structural balance. That's not what happened, and oil prices dropped, and probably to this day it costs us about $600 million. At that point, I'd say we have to take some other kind of steps now. And that's what we're going to try to do. I mean, I think it's the only responsible thing to do. But remember, the only thing on the table is higher education and health care. And those are vital to the state of Louisiana. So I'm the same question would go to anybody in this room. You got a choice. The three things you can cut: higher education, health care, and state offices. You'll see all the state offices tomorrow. You'll see all the state offices taking big hits. And that leaves higher education and health care, because there is no other place to get money in the state of Louisiana. Everything else is locked away.
What's wrong with having more revenue? You can raise taxes.
If you're talking about raising taxes, that won't come out of the legislature, I'm sorry. But the revenues all already come into the state of Louisiana. We just need to do a better job of allocating those revenues to higher education and health care.
I want to say, first of all, on the subject of tax exemptions, I want to congratulate Senator Donahue. He has stepped out on this issue more than just about anybody in the legislature, and started the conversation. And the phrase structural deficit is something that's in vogue now. That's a phrase I stole from Jack and continue to talk about. So I'm glad we're having that conversation. But to your question of tax incentives, I think there's kind of two debates here. A tax incentive for business is very good for the people who work in that business. The question is, would that business come to Louisiana without that gift from the taxpayers? And that's a question we need to be asking ourselves. We wrote an op-ed recently about the Sasol project in southwest Louisiana. They got a $3 billion in property tax incentives. They're getting $257 million from the state. And this is a very big project. It's going to employ a lot of people in the construction phase, and then 750 people once it's all up and running. And Stephen Morey says, well, it's going to have a positive return on investment for the state ultimately. I think Greg Albrecht, the economist at the fiscal office, has questioned whether that actually has a long-term benefit to taxpayers. But what we learned was that Sasol is much more reactive to fundamental issues of supply and demand and the price of oil and the differential between oil and gas prices, and they decided when the price of oil dropped, you know, I don't care how much money you put on the table, Louisiana, we're going to delay this project. And so from our point of view, if you do the fundamental things right, if you can educate your people, if you can build strong roads, if you can have safe streets, if you can invest in those things, maybe you don't need to put up as much money on the table to get corporations to come here. The other things on kind of the overall tax burden, I think it's one of the things we learned when the governor proposed to get rid of the state income tax 2 years ago, which thankfully died a quick death. They brought in the Tax Foundation, and the Tax Foundation put out a lot of numbers, and one of those was Louisiana's overall tax burden. We're 47th in the percentage of state and local, the percentage of income that goes to state and local taxes, about 7.8%. So we're a very low tax state overall by anyone's definition. If having low taxes was the only factor in being a good business state, we would be at the top of all those lists that we're near the bottom. So I would argue there is room to have a conversation about revenue. You know, we've tried the cuts-only approach for 7 years. There's been certainly some good cuts that probably needed to be made, but the low-hanging fruit has been picked a long time ago, and now we're really looking at cutting into critical services, and I would argue if you keep cutting those critical services, it's going to be harder and harder to attract these companies and attract business and make the state what we want it to be.
Nikki?
Hi, Nikki.
Stand up.
Hi, I'm Nikki Papazagakis. My question would be that if healthcare, education, and state government are important areas, I would argue that there are statutorily, I mean, we would agree that there are statutorily funded programs that are of less priority than those. So is there an appetite at all within the legislature for a constitutional convention? And if not, why? What would be the downside of restructuring it so that we have more to play with in the budget than just those 3 areas?
You know, I don't really have enough experience to answer your question in the detail that you asked it. But I would say this, from those people around who have been here a long time, the problem with the Constitutional Convention is you don't know what the outcome is. So you and I might agree what we'd like to do is we'd like to get some of these things that are locked away and put them on the table so we can establish our own priorities. That might not be what comes out of the Constitutional Convention. And it could be because there's other forces at work that more stuff is locked away and you can't get to it. So my answer to your question would be that you can't be assured what the outcome of the Constitutional Convention would be, therefore it's risky to do it, because we might not be able to solve what we see as the problem, and I think we probably agree on what the problem is. Probably many of us in the room do, but that may not be what comes out of the convention, and you can't stop it. What comes out, comes out. So that's why it didn't happen.
Stuart. Steve, I'm sorry, Steve.
I'm Steve Monahan, and I do appreciate the conversation is approaching the point where there are so many truths in the room that you become so adequately confused that you cannot have a conversation with each other about the truths. If this were the year of 1987 through 92, we'd be talking about what Dr. Ryan brought up, the industrial tax exemptions, the 10-year industrial tax exemptions. And that, and I don't want to make a speech, but I see paralysis of purpose being where we are right now again. In 87, 92, that was a hot issue in the legislature, and the argument was until folks give up the homestead exemption, then we can't do anything about the industrial tax exemptions. And that argument continued until that whole debate ended. So two quick questions, and Jan could address it, and Senator also, because I do want to say I appreciate the discussion, Senator Donahue, that you've come forward on the exemption issue quite a way. The question is this: how much progress have we made in the examination of the exemptions and the industrial tax exemption in regard to jobs created? There were statistics that were abound previously. 5 jobs created permanent, X amount of dollars per job. So how far have we come to police that on the industrial exemption side, so we don't have a lot of data anymore that seems to be public? And on the other exemptions, I thought one of the problems that we noted in the discussions was the lack of a sunset. That the exemptions required 2/3 of the vote to remove, but simple majority to approve. So is there any insight into those two big pieces of revenue? And I'd appreciate it if we making progress or are we at a standstill? Thank you.
Let me see if I can understand your two questions. The first, on the tax exemption. Whoa. All right, thank you. On industrial tax exemptions, I can't tell you too much about the industrial tax exemptions. It's a separate board. It comes before them. It's almost perfunctory as to whether they're approved or not approved. It's been here forever. I don't know the ins or outs of the industrial tax exemption. Perhaps I should know more about it, but it's not on my plate, so I don't.
It doesn't require, since it's constitutional, it does not require a cost-benefit analysis like the economic development exemptions. It's just been in the Constitution. It just happened.
What he said, Steve. What was your second question? I forgot.
On the sunset provision.
Oh, yeah. Okay, let me say that. Yeah, on sunset, I tell you, I mean, I kind of in my mind have it that no bill will ever come through my committee that awards any dollars to anybody that doesn't have a sunset on it. I think you just can't do it. I fight to get these things back up so we can look at and maybe get rid of some that aren't being effective, and it's very, very difficult. The solar power, for example, is one of them. I battle in my own mind, why does government subsidize a certain business over somebody else's business to make them successful? If you could be subsidized 80% of your operation, could you be successful? Well, gee, I mean, I'm trying to think, I'm getting subsidized 0, and I'm in competition, so 80, why does the government get to choose that? Well, I mean, that's a good question, but I think everything needs to have a sunset on it. And I think solar power does. I think it's sunset in 2017.
I would echo what Dr. Ryan said about the industrial tax exemption, and I completely agree with the sunset. I mean, one of the problems with these tax exemptions is they get on the books, they maybe don't get a lot of attention the first time around, and then it becomes an expense of state government, but it's an expense that doesn't show up in the budget, and if that expense continues to grow, and a lot of these programs are direct spending. It's not a program where somebody is paying less taxes than they otherwise would. It's a direct check right out of the Treasury. That's frankly what we do with the film program. That's what we do with a lot of these programs. It has nothing to do with tax liability and everything to do with writing checks that don't show up in the budget. And they're a classic example. Again, the solar credit is one of them. The fracking exemption is another. This was a 2-year exemption on paying severance taxes for horizontal drilling in North Louisiana. It was passed in 1994 at a time when there was no horizontal drilling going on anywhere in Louisiana. So it had no fiscal note whatsoever. And then 10 years later, we've got the Haynesville Shale and a lot of this activity, and we can't tax any of it because we passed this exemption. So these things need to come up for periodic review. That's just simply common sense, and to see if there's a good cost-benefit analysis. Now, I will say LED does a pretty good job on some of these exemptions of studying them and seeing how they work. A lot of what we know about the unaffordability of the film credit program is from studies done by LED or commissioned by LED. The same is true for the enterprise zone tax credit, for example, where we pay retailers to create jobs that aren't even in low-income areas. We pay Walmart and Target and these stores and Walgreens to locate wherever they want. We pay them a credit for everybody they hire. This is money that's just going out the door that doesn't need to be going out the door. We know about this because LED has done the studies, and so in some sense the research is there. What needs to happen is for these programs to come up for review and for people to have the fortitude to kill them, or maybe or alter them in some way that protects the taxpayers.
Let me add one more thing. I can't help but get a plug in for this. Last year I had a bill. With revenue that comes into the state of Louisiana, we have a full-person commission called a Revenue Estimating Commission. And they look at the revenue. They have to recognize it before the legislature can appropriate it. So I put a bill in last year that mandated that the revenue from the $350 million worth of economic development programs that we have has to be recognized by the Revenue Estimating Conference and actually put into the appropriation process. Money's not appropriated, but we get to see it. Right now, if you want to see it, you have to go someplace else. So it puts it in the process so we can see it. You know, I didn't think anybody would be objecting to the legislature looking at $350 some odd million before we give it away, and the bill was vetoed by the governor. So I'll have the bill coming back up again. It's not a monumental bill. I just want the legislature to see the amount of money that we give it away so we can recognize it. That's all we have to do, but apparently that was too much. So there are some people working in that direction.
In the back.
Is this working?
Turn the there you
Can you help her with the mic?
Working now?
Here's the mic.
Okay. When the senator was speaking, and the question was about.
Stand up so we can hear you.
Okay, and the question was about constitutional convention, and it seems to me that there are a lot of people in this room, and potentially a lot of people in the legislature, who understand what actually needs to be done in order for the state of Louisiana to become more financially stable / solid. However, what he described to me reminded me of the old Chinese fable of the convicted felon that was placed before the two doors. And when he asked what's behind door number 1, they said, a tiger that's going to tear you to pieces and kill you. And he said, well, what's behind door number 2? And they said, we don't know. And invariably, everybody chose the door with a tiger.
Question.
So the question is, and it seems to me that the legislature, the people don't trust each other in order to be able to come up with a consensus, to have the convention, and what the purpose and the goals would be on behalf of the people of the state of Louisiana. So my question to the senator and anyone else is it going to take the state becoming bankrupt and complete insolvency and chaos for the legislature to get to the point to say the financial structure that we've created constitutionally no longer works? Or will they be able to do something before that on behalf of their constituents in the state in order to save the state?
Listen, sometimes people just disagree, and you and I disagree. I don't think that's the savior for the state. I think the legislature needs to work probably with the new governor on a plan. I don't think any of the 4 candidates for governor are in favor of a constitutional convention for the reason that I gave before. You can't predict the outcome, so even if you and I agree on what the problem is and what the solution is, we can't know that that's going to come out of that convention. It could come out worse than it is right now. So maybe it is like the tiger behind the door, but I just disagree that I would want to take that step, not because I'm afraid, because I don't know that the outcome is going to be what I think the outcome should be. So we're going to have to disagree with that.
I would also say that you need to be careful. I mean, when you look at all this constitutionally protected money, I think you need to realize that most of that is protected, all of it is protected for a reason. And somebody needs to say, well, what pot of money is out there that's protected that we want to take from and use for something else? The biggest amount of protected money is the MFP that pays for public schools. And Steve can talk for an hour about the MFP. It's not perfect, but I don't think anybody wants to unfreeze that money. And then a lot of it, again, is pension obligations and things that we really have no choice but to spend. Another huge chunk is incarceration. As long as you have the incarceration rate that we have in this state. You put people in jail, you have to pay for them. You don't really have a choice. So if we want to have a big conversation about sentencing reform in this state and reducing the prison population, that's a conversation that can happen. But I don't think you need a constitutional convention to do it. And I think I hear this talk a lot, but I don't hear anybody saying this is money that's behind a constitutional wall or a statutory wall that we really need to be cutting. I mean, show me the area of state government that is fat and happy and needs a lot of cuts to it. I haven't seen it. I don't think anybody can tell you what part of state government needs to be cut.
I have just one quick question. I don't think I need the mic, you all can hear me up here.
They got to be able to hear you back there.
Okay. All right. My question is, the money that we speak about, money going to companies, big-time business around the state of Louisiana, you give them big bucks. I listened to a report the other night, how much money is going to some of the companies that's coming into Louisiana. Like you just said, Walmart, Target, not only them, but you got a lot of others too. And as soon as they get the employees hired, next few months they are fired. Now we're giving them so much money and incentives to bring employees into the state and into their job for working. And as soon as they go to work, next 3 or 4 months they hire. What happens to the money that has been given to these companies that we taxpayers is taking care of?
It's really not a lot of fun to be dealing with legislative hearings.
But we admire your courage.
Listen, you get the nerve to show up.
The thing that you happen to be picking on is called the enterprise zone tax credit. And the largest user of the enterprise zone tax credit in the state of Louisiana is Walmart. And number 2 is Walgreens. Yeah. Now, in 1990, I think 1998, somebody added the provision that would allow retail to do that. Most other states, I don't know of any other states that allow retail and restaurants to be a beneficiary of the enterprise zone tax credit. We got that out last year, so that won't be happening anymore. But the question is, who monitors those types of things to make sure? That's really one of the reasons that I think that retail's out of it, because it's almost impossible to monitor what Walmart's doing and Walgreens, because these people turn over so quickly. So we won't have those retail exemptions anymore. So, when businesses come in, they're based on jobs, and I've got to tell you that I don't know the extent at which the Department of Economic Development continues to monitor them. I think as long as they continue to get money from the Department of Economic Development, that every year they have to apply, and every year that's monitored. So I'm going to say it's monitored every year based on their submissions, and if they don't submit, they don't get anything.
Senator, with using your power, would you look into how much oversight there is on the job creation? Because that is something, you've got someone who is promoting Louisiana, and we're all in favor of that, but should they also be regulated? Shouldn't that be over at revenue?
I want to say this, and I hope I'm not telling you incorrectly. I wouldn't tell you something I didn't believe to be correct. To the best of my knowledge, the credits that are issued by the Department of Economic Development are monitored fairly closely. I don't want to use the word fairly. They're monitored closely, and those people that are supposed to produce jobs and they get something out of it, they produce those jobs, and if they don't get the money. That's my impression of how it works.
Well, we'll have to get you a copy of Channel 9's report on that from Lee Zurich and show you a different picture. And we have one more question. Oh, Stuart?
My name is Stuart Stewart, and I'm a Texas transplant. I've been living here for 22 and a half years, so I do consider Louisiana my home of choice. When we talk about these tax exemptions, when one is on the table for a particular industry, either because we have sought out that industry or they have come to us, Is there a mechanism in place, and if not, why not, to procure their environmental record?
You work to the department.
Well, I'll say this, I mean.
No, come on.
I love talking about this because the film industry doesn't really pollute, but I've actually thought about having smokestacks installed on the top of our sound stages so we get a little bit more respect. But that's a good question, and I really don't know that I have the answer.
Yeah. See, the way they actually work, even though you're absolutely right, but the way the legislation works, it says, all right, if we're going to have a economic development and tax incentive, it's about jobs or it's about this or about that. The Department of Economic Development will look at you and say, in answer to your question, that's not my job. That's the Department of Environmental Quality's job. If they give them a permit to operate within the environmental laws of the state of Louisiana, then Economic Development says, well, we're going to give them benefits for creating jobs. So maybe it should not be, but right now it's because it's handled in two different parts of state government.
Tim, but isn't the environmental quality looking specifically at that project rather than the history of the company?
Well, no, DEQ is supposed to I mean, they're making a judgment. It's a problem whenever you improve something in advance. Yeah, we know there's a lot of politics, and we know there's campaign contributions, and we know the reality of the way state government operates. But when they're making a projection of what's going to happen, they're not monitoring what actually happened when you're talking about this project. And so, yeah, that's part of what DEQ is supposed to do. They're supposed to look at all the factors, but in general, what they do is they look at performance. Or they look at what you've actually done, and they monitor emissions and so forth and so on. I mean, there's a lot of things that can be changed in that area. We have been criticized forever, 50 years, for selling our environment for jobs. Well, if we've done it, we haven't done a very good job of it, because as who was talking about out-migration, significant net out-migration, our economy is still very weak, so it's not a good trade-off.
Okay, ladies and gentlemen, we're going to call it a day, and we'll thank our panelists, and especially Senator Donahue for doing great. Jack, we'd always like to have you come back because you're straightforward and you answer the people honestly, and that's greatly appreciated. Tim, great to see you again. Nice to see you again, Patrick, and always a pleasure, John. So remember, next month we have the third Thursday. We'll have another program, and it'll be on another hot topic. Thank you so much. And if you haven't joined already, consider joining Leaders with Vision.